So today you're going to learn that good photography is more than just a shot in the dark. And today's program is an introduction to photography. Now I have a 12-hour program that I have reduced down to about 30 to 35, 40 minutes. And so I urge you to join me in my lessons online to dive deeply into the topics. But today we're going to cover the camera operations in the basic digital photography, which we're going to cover a little bit the difference between DSLR and mirrorless. We're going to make sure you understand how to go from automatic to programmed auto exposure. We'll talk a little bit about the accessories and storage media. We've got to cover file formats and exposure modes. We'll talk about the tripod of photography, and once you master that, you will have a great handle on the craft of photography. We'll talk about ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And then we'll end with how to get more wow in your pictures. So where do you start? Well, from the very beginning, we can sit in a classroom or we can sit online and talk to each other for weeks on end, but it's when you go out in the field and practice. Now, out in the field could mean in your living room, in your backyard, or even further afield. But you have to practice what we learn in the lessons to really internalize it and be successful. So we're going to cover a little bit, just a little, about DSLR and mirrorless. Either you have a digital single lens reflex camera, that's where the mirror pops up and down, or a mirrorless that doesn't have that. So a mirrorless camera is lighter, it's more compact, it's faster and better for video, and there are fewer lens and accessories, although they are coming up to speed very quickly with lots of new accessories and lenses. And I have my eye on a new one because I also have a mirrorless camera as well as a DSLR. With a DSLR, you know, they've been around for many, many years. You have a wide lens selection, and it has an optical viewfinder that actually works better in low light levels. But it's more complex and it's bulkier. So those are the main advantages and disadvantages between the two camera styles. So if you're shooting on automatic, raise your hand. Well, okay, I probably really can't see you raising your hand, but after today, there is no reason for you to shoot on auto. What you'll want to do is put your camera in P for programmed auto exposure. It's also known as photographer or professional, but P on the dial. And that will give you better image size, a little bit more control, but it's quite a bit like auto. And the way you control that is with your ISO. So no more automatic. You'll be happy that you went into P today. So what's in the box? It always comes with a battery. I urge you to, if you only have one battery, to go buy another one right away. Because if you have no battery power, then you are not photographing. There's usually only one cable that comes with a camera now, and that's usually a USB that you plug into your computer. I leave this here because I want to remind myself to tell you about dust on the sensor and why you want to always turn your camera off before you plug anything in. So the strap usually comes with, and I have a whole discussion on changing out some of the straps and that. Also, nowadays you don't have a manual typically that comes with the camera. If there is a manual, it's so basic that it doesn't give you real answers for any deeper questions. So you can download it from the manufacturer's website, and I recommend that you keep that on your cell phone so that when you're out in the field, everybody has their cell phone on them, hopefully, and you can refer to it right there. You always have it with you. And then the software. You don't necessarily need the software that comes with the camera, because you can use Windows Media if you have a PC, or Photos if you have a Mac. So if you see these spots here, this one up here on the right, that really looks like a bird, but it's so indistinct, I retouched that out. But if you see these other spots, that's dust on the sensor. You want to avoid that at all costs. So the reason, one of the ways that you avoid this is by always turning your camera off before you take off the lens, or well, that would be dust, taken off the lens. So if you're outside, make sure it's not really windy. If you're at the beach, don't do it outside. Go to the restroom or something where you can control somewhat the environment, or go in your car and change it there. And that's because there's an electrical current going through the sensor. And when you take that lens off, it acts like a magnet for all the dirt and dust, and that's how you get dust on the sensor. So there is a cleaning kit that you can get, and I just got this from their website. I think you can get it on Amazon. And they actually have videos on their site as to how to use all of this equipment. So if you see this bulb here, this blower bulb, that's the only thing you want to do when you're cleaning your camera. If you take the lens off, you just want to squirt it in there. Never use that canned air, because it has chemicals in it and it will destroy the sensor. So don't ever use canned air inside. So the strap, the software, and filters. A lot of times people will try to sell you filters to go onto your lens. There are two camps, one that says buy them, the other that says don't buy them. I don't buy them because it affects the contrast in our pictures. And if you've noticed your lens, the lens is curved like the meniscus curve on our knee, and a filter is flat. So it bends the light rays coming into through the lens. Also, glass has color, even if it's very subtle. And so that also has an impact on our pictures. So with that said, however, there are a couple of filters that I do use that you cannot reproduce in Photoshop, and that's a polarizing filter. And we go into this in much more detail in the lessons, but this is an example of what a polarizing filter does. The before, it has glare, and when you turn it and you bend the light rays coming into the lens, you eliminate that glare. So a polarizing filter helps with glare. You can't fix that in Photoshop. It also makes the sky a darker blue. A lens hood is very important. Frequently they come with the lens, but if they don't, you should go to the camera manufacturer's website, find out what model you need, and then you can order it on Amazon. You want to use a lens hood always, shooting outside, shooting inside, and the picture on the right shows it attached to my camera. This helps control the light, all the light hitting the lens, the glass part of the lens, but it also helps to eliminate lens flare. Now this picture on the right shows a very dramatized picture of lens flare. This style came into popularity a number of years ago, but frankly, it's just bad photography. You would never shoot directly into the sun because the sun can damage the sensor and it can damage your eyes. But using a lens hood, shooting directly at the sun, it's not going to eliminate that anyway. The purpose of a lens hood is to eliminate stray light coming from the sides. Now, the good part of this picture is that the subject is outlined with light, and that's called rim lighting. Sometimes it's called hair lighting. But the good part of this is he is distinctly separate from the background. If there were no light on the back of him, he would blend in with his dark red sweater and his dark hair. He would blend in with the background. So in that regard, this type of light is advantageous. It's a good thing. But regardless, you never want, you don't want lens flare unless you do it intentionally like this. Now, another purchase that you must consider if you're serious about photography is a tripod. And make sure it's not too short. You can get it in 3 or 4 sections. I think if it's in 4 sections, it folds down flatter for travel. I mean, it's more convenient for travel. And get some with flip levers instead of the twists. I've spent money on more than one occasion on twist legs, and you can't tell if the leg is fastened tight, whereas you can with a flip lever, and I have pictures of this for you. You want to get a ball head, and they come with a quick release plate, or you can buy rails or a separate quick release plate. And Manfrotto and Benro are good names. They've been in the industry a long time. I have one of each, and you'll want to know the difference between carbon fiber and aluminum. Carbon fiber is lighter than aluminum. If you're doing much traveling, every ounce really counts, so you might be more in favor of a carbon fiber tripod. However, carbon fiber is a bit more expensive, so you have to evaluate the trade-off. So here is one of my tripods, and this is one of my travel tripods. And you've got some fasteners here that you could adjust the legs vertically or horizontally, not up and down. But let's say you're on an uneven terrain and you want to lift one of the legs separately, you can do it with this. And here are the flip levers. And this is the ball head. So this moves very smoothly when you want to adjust your camera. And this little notch here allows you to tilt the camera on its side and face it front. So that notch is what that's for. Now the quick release plate goes in here. You take it out of the tripod. After you set the tripod up, you take it out of the tripod, screw it into the bottom of your camera. There's a little screw hole in there. And once that's fastened in there, tight, not too tight, but tight enough, you put that back into the head here, and you tighten this knob down. Make sure that everything is tightened and fastened correctly before you let go of your camera. And I like these knobs because, hang on just one second. Okay, sorry. I like these knobs because they're small. They don't get in the way when you're trying to make adjustments rather than the long handles. All right, so here is one of the tripods that I recommend. This is an aluminum tripod, and I use this for flat lays in the studio. And I recommend that if you don't know what a flat lay is, I have a sample coming up. But the center rod comes up and lays flat so that you can photograph your artwork or your flat lay perpendicular. And also what I like about this tripod, it has a little foam handle on one of the legs. You will really appreciate this if you are photographing out in cold weather, and even when you grip it, your hand won't freeze to the metal. And here it is sideways. So your camera is on here and your flat lay is directly below. And this is a flat lay. So you can get very precisely over your subject. Now let's talk a little bit about storage media. There's lots to know, there's lots of them out there. The main thing to know is that you're looking for a particular speed. If you're doing any video with your camera, you're going to want to look for that little 10 in the circle here. And you're probably going to want an SDHC, which means high capacity. You also are looking for a speed, and down here on the bottom, this, you can see R means read, and it reads at 95 megabytes per second, and W, write, it writes at 60 megabytes per second. So that's reading and writing to the card. If you look in your owner's manual, it will tell you exactly what kind of memory cards to buy. It won't tell you the capacity, and I recommend that you start with a 64 gigabyte. And if you're doing a lot of video, I would start with a 128 gigabyte. You can get bigger cards, but it's important to know that this is the first place you can have problems with corrupted files after user error. This is the next delicate stage of your photography. Memory is cheap, buy more memory cards. When I'm traveling, I use a memory card for every day, so that if my camera's lost or stolen, or it falls into the water, or any number of other things that could happen, or the card gets corrupted, I've only lost 1 day of shooting of pictures. And so in the lessons, I talk more about traveling with memory cards and electronics and that sort of thing. But one thing I want to point out here is that if you see this little lock, you can lock the card. And when you lock the card, you can't write any more pictures to it, and you can't erase them. So that might be a little safeguard for you. And you'll easily be able to see that in your camera and in your computer. So I think that's all I want to say about that today. But here is a sample of corrupted files. If you see something like this on the back of your camera with the card still in, or this after you've downloaded, the one on the right, that's the time to get all the pictures off that card and destroy it. Do not try to keep using that card, because this means one sector has gone bad. You never know when the next sector is going to go bad, and there's no reason to run that risk. Memory is cheap. Use a new card. So I want to introduce you to file formats, and I'm sure that you, well, maybe you are familiar with the JPEG format. It's a compressed file made inside your camera, and it causes irreversible compression. And if you're just starting out with your photography, it's fine to work in the largest JPEG file that you can. RAW, on the other hand, is not compressed, and it has the most data, and you can work with it the best in post-production. There's no deterioration in your raw files. So again, we go over this in great detail in our lessons. So now we're going to talk about the exposure modes. You're probably used to seeing something like this. This is Canon. I'll show you the Nikons in a minute. But these are all the auto icons. This is like you don't even have to think about anything. You set it on here, you point and shoot. You can't even control the focusing point. So there really is no reason to use this after today, because I'll show you the other modes that it's easy to progress to from here on. And for Nikon, here are the exposure modes. Again, these are auto, and you can see they're very similar to the Canon. The adjustable icons for Canon are P for programmed auto exposure, TV for shutter priority, AV for aperture priority, and M for manual. That's where you set everything. On Nikon, you've got PSAM. I like the simplicity of Nikon's nomenclature here. P, again, for programmed auto exposure. S for shutter priority, which means you set the shutter speed, the camera automatically sets the aperture. A for aperture priority, which means you set the aperture, and it stays there where you set it, and the camera automatically sets the shutter speed. So it's halfway automatic. And M for manual, and that's where, again, you set everything. Now, when I am photographing outdoors, landscape, travel photography, my choice is to shoot in aperture priority. That's because I generally know what the exposure is, setting the ISO, and I'm concerned about my depth of field. Again, we get very thoroughly into this in the lessons. So here is the tripod of photography. And when you master this, you will have a good handle on the craft of photography. So ISO is like our film speed. And white balance goes hand in hand with ISO. When you set the ISO, meaning setting what you think is appropriate for the light source, you also set the white balance. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this too. Aperture, that's the size of the opening in the lens, and the shutter speed. So what does ISO mean? When we shot with film, it's the same thing. It's the same correlation from film to digital, same measurements, but now we have a lot more of them. And it's the sensitivity to light. So this is my broad brush stroke about ISO, low, average, and high sensitivity. In really simple terms, you might think of ISO like this. A low f-stop gets a low ISO, and a high f-stop gets a high ISO. But it also depends on what you're photographing, either action or stationary subjects. So while this might be an easy way for you to think about it, there is a lot more information that goes with this. So if you look for WB on your camera, and typically that's going to be on the outside because you could be changing it a lot. And these are presets that you can use when you're shooting in JPEG mode. And that means if you're in daylight, you shoot with daylight. If it's cloudy outside, you turn it on cloudy. If you're under fluorescent lights, you turn it on fluorescent. If you're underwater with the fishies, then your camera is going to be in a waterproof housing. And now we have white balance for underwater. So when you were probably in grammar school, you learned about the color wheel, the primary colors and the complementary colors. Without going into a great amount of detail here, what the camera does, it adds a complementary color to give you a more natural looking white balance. Again, more coverage in the lessons. But as you probably recognize, this is the White House. And I used 3 different white balances so you can see the effect of what the camera does automatically for you with white balance. So aperture is your f-stop, and with your aperture you control the depth of field and you control the light. So here is the aperture in our lens. In picture number 1, this is a wide open aperture. Picture number 2, same aperture, but it's closed down. A wide, shallow aperture is going to give you numbers like this. Average is 5.6 to f8. And narrow and deep, like in picture number 2, it's going to give you higher numbers like this. In our lessons, we go through this so that you understand it. But on the left, this is a picture of a deep depth of field. As you can see, everything in the foreground is very sharply in focus, as well as the background. So you can see deep into the picture, everything is sharp. This shallow depth of field, the front of the subject is very sharp, but behind the subject is blurry. It's a soft focus. That's called a shallow depth of field. Now with our little animal here, we've got the focus on his nose and his teeth and the hay that he's eating. And you'll notice that this alpaca's eyes are out of focus. Well, that's because I have a shallow depth of field. I've focused on his nose, but the depth of field isn't deep enough to keep his eyes in focus, and clearly not his ears. So if you're photographing your pet, you want to make sure that you have a depth of field that's deep enough and focus on the eyes. And with a deep depth of field, the eyes, the nose, the ears will be in focus. And I tell you, this will take practice, so don't get discouraged. So now let's talk about shutter speed. It's the time the shutters open. You control the action, and you control the light here too. So these, again, are my broad brush strokes as far as shutter speeds. Slow is 30 seconds, and the little quotes mark is a slow shutter speed, and you'll need a tripod for that. A shutter speed of 1/25 of a second to 1/50 of a second, you can hand hold and use your image stabilizer or vibration reduction. An average shutter speed is 1/60th to 1/160th, and fast is anything faster than that. So in this picture on the left, a fast shutter speed basically stops the action in the water. Compared to the one on the right, exactly the same composition, same focus. You can see the logs in focus in both, but the water that is moving, it's creating motion in your picture. And here's a closer picture. You can see that everything's in focus, but this is a 1-second exposure, which gives us this misty, moving water feel. In here, we've got the same F11, where the water fountain and the building, the letters, everything's in focus from near to far. But you can see the water droplets in the air. And that's because we're at 1/640th of a second. Very fast. It's stopped the action. So now you put it all together when you're in the manual mode. You set the ISO, the white balance, the aperture and shutter speed, and in the handout, you'll want to be sure and download this. I'll put the link to it at the end so you can link to it and download the handout. You can print out the whole thing or just this page. It's full size. But you want to cut this out and keep it in your camera bag. Laminate it so it lasts for almost forever. And you'll see along the bottom, the low sensitivity ISO, 50, 100, it's pretty sharp. As you increase the ISO, it starts to get more pixelated. The higher the pixel, the higher the number, the more pixelation, but the higher the sensitivity. Shutter speeds fast really stop the action, and you can see by this guide that the slower the shutter speed, the blurrier your subject gets. And then for aperture, a small aperture, that little tiny hole, will give you a very deep depth of field. Everything will be sharp from near to far. But as that aperture opens up, the wider the opening, the blurrier the background becomes. So where do you go from here? Well, you go beyond the basics. You work on your composition. We have creativity projects. You learn what's under the hood, all the tools that you can use. You've got to get your digital workflow established. And Lightroom and Photoshop. It is the industry standard for post-processing your pictures. And it takes a little bit to learn it, but once you do, you won't know what you did without it. So to get a little bit more wow, the biggest, bestest tip I can give you today is use your rule of thirds. It's like tic-tac-toe. And when you put your subject where these lines intersect, on the left is horizontal, on the right is when you turn your camera vertically, you will immediately have a more powerful image. But even further to that, if you place your subject in any one of the four corners, it will be very powerful, much more interesting than putting your subject smack dab in the middle. So demonstrating with this picture here, I've overlaid the tic-tac-toe or the rule of thirds. Notice where I put the subject. The subject and his reflection is on the left-hand side, mostly in the lower left square. But also notice that the logs are also pointing to the subject. These are leading lines. And notice that the tree line goes up. It's another leading line. You've got a leading line across here, and the background is made up of cinder cone material, but the color also leads your eye, and it adds interest throughout the image. Yes, all of this was intentional. So in photography, we like S curves, C curves, and triangles. So we've got a C curve here. We've got a straight horizon line. We've got soft feet and ankles, S curves, heads tilted. But also notice the position the subjects are in. And look in the background, and it repeats the natural element in the background. So let's try this one. So it's important to pay attention to where your horizon line is. Right now, it's intersecting her camera and her neck and her head. A better way to treat this is to have the horizon line above or below. So you either have to get much higher than the subject or much lower so that her head is in the sky. Now, we've eliminated the horizon line here, but if you look at this one, The horizon line is not straight. Your viewer will see that. They may not recognize that it's crooked, but you have to see that. You have to see everything and fix it, preferably in camera, but always fix it in post-production. Now you'll also notice that, frankly, we've got another horizon line that is actually the surf line. And again, it's intersecting her camera and her hat just like it was over here. So again, above and below the subject will help eliminate that. So always give your subject nose room. You'll notice the bike, even though it's an inanimate object, I've left room in front of it to move out of the picture. When you're doing family portraits outside, make sure that you have open shade. This little piece of shade was the only shade on the property at that time of day. Now, you don't always have a choice about what time of day you photograph, particularly for family events. So do yourself a favor, find open shade. And what I did with this also is my husband here on the left was the photographer for me to stand here and everybody else to be there. And we captured this picture. We traded places. He came and stood over here, and I was able to crop him out and add him to this picture digitally. Don't you love Photoshop? Another thing we cover, environmental group portraits and clothing for your portraits. You want to match the environment if you're doing it outside. Denim, khaki, white shirts blend so well with the rocks and the sunset and the water. Bold colors like red and black would clash with this environment. So always think about that if you're doing your own family portrait out at the beach or in a park. When you're posting groups of people, stairways are very handy. But always remember look behind and see what's coming out of any heads. And you can photograph it horizontally, or if you go to the one on the right, it looks much better because this one is shot vertically, and we've got now more interesting trees. And while I've moved this subject a little bit, we've still got a tree behind your head. So we want to work with that even a little more. And ideally, I might move the whole group over, but then we've got this line in the center. That's easy to take out in Photoshop. Photoshop is your friend. So what do you see here? First of all, I need you to know that this is a selfie of a friend of mine. She gave me permission to use it here. This is her morning look. And she posted this, and that's how I saw it, and I asked her if I could share it with you. And you have to see everything in a picture before you let the world see it. Now, she was making a statement about her bedhead and all that, but the picture is crooked, and you can see some of the background here. And of course, the color is off. The color is really bad. So again, you want to fix that with your white balance. But look at the towel bar coming out of her head. I asked her if she slept on the towel bar overnight. She didn't even see that. So you, as the photographer and the artist, have to see everything in the background before you publish anything. So there's night photography techniques with a slow shutter speed. There's light writing. This is star trails. And then landscape photography done with a bunch of filters. Yes, I used a bunch of several filters to get this effect. Here are panoramas. This is I did with my iPhone 8. Don't you love the iPhones? With wildlife photography, you get the details but blur out the background. In here, we have given the birds nose room, shallow depth of field. You can see the plant in the lower right corner. It's blurred out so it doesn't detract from the subject. Macro photography, this is a very shallow depth of field. And again, shallow depth of field, and we can really focus in on the water droplets. So now you know that good photography is more than just a shot in the dark. And here is all the ways that you can connect with me, my website, on social media. And again, you'll have this in the handout.